So the second session is going to examine macroeconomic forces, including new pathways of structural transformation that involve service-led and digitally enabled growth, and how these dynamics relate to gender gaps in the economy. So to start us off, we have Dr. Gaurav Chiplunkar, assistant professor at the Darden Business School, University of Virginia, who studies the causes and consequences of labor market frictions in low-income countries, with a particular emphasis on the barriers faced by women and youth, the transformative potential of digital technologies and industrial policy reforms in mitigating these barriers, their aggregate implications on the allocation of resources and talent in the economy, and their consequences on economic growth and productivity. So he'll be presenting his work, two of his papers, Employment Effects of Mobile Internet in Developing Countries, and the aggregate implications of barriers to female entrepreneurship, and then take some questions. So Professor, you have 20 minutes for the presentation, and Ananya will flag when you have 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and 1 minute left. Then the audience has 5 minutes to ask some initial questions. As always, please raise a hand, wait for the mic, introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then ask your questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for having me on the program. And really excited that the first panel was very stimulating and set the tone for the discussions in the coming day. So very happy to play a small part in continuing this conversation. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of my work on looking at digitally enabled workforce. And that's been a core interest of mine. And gender plays a huge role. As we all know, I don't need to defend this to this audience on how important a role gender plays as we think about the future of the workforce. Okay. So specifically, I mean, the one thing I've learned from presenting my work is that digital enabling means a lot of things for a lot of people. Rightfully so, right? So today I'm going to specifically talk about cell phone internet. So think about smartphones. And the reason one should care about this is basically this graph. So what I'm showing you is on the horizontal axis over time, what you see is in the dotted line at the bottom, basically as of 2005 and 2010, and this is an average across countries in the world, nobody owned smartphones in the 2005s and 2010s. And the solid black line basically is telling you the rapid adoption of smartphones across different countries in the world. And India obviously is a great leader in adoption of smartphones. And so just to give you some statistics, less than one person on average owned a smartphone in 2005, and that's about 75 per 100 people across the world. In India, it's over 100. 100 smartphone owners per 100 people. So it's a big thing. And so what we started thinking about is to plagiarize from the workshop's first sentence on the printed sheet in front of you. Basically, there have been uneven gender effects when we think about how economic and global environments are changing, and it's of imminent policy interest, especially in the Indian context. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is the impact of 3G internet rollout across about 700 regions in the world, covering over 14 countries. Unfortunately, because of lack of data, India and China are not in the sample, but hopefully in the future we can talk about that. But this is just to give you a very broad sense. And coming to, I think, what Aishwarya motivated in the morning, I think the plan here is not to give you definitive answers, but hopefully raise more questions. And given that this is the first workshop, maybe every time we learn something new as we go along this agenda. And the big question is that we're going to try and look at today is basically, does it mitigate or exacerbate gender gaps in the labor force? And does it accelerate structural transformation and economic growth? And structural transformation just basically means, do people move out of agriculture into non-agricultural sectors like manufacturing and services? And it's going to draw on two papers that I've been working with Professor Penelope Goldberg. And Penny is at Yale, and she's one of the lead academics on the gender and growth gaps. And so it's going to draw on these two papers. Okay, so when you think about a problem like this, there are three things you need, right? One is data on outcomes. How can we measure employment and transitions and so on and so forth? And so we're going to make use of this excellent data set on IPMs. And the reason I'm showing you the data slides in a 20-minute talk is just because if there are students or if there are other policy practitioners, researchers who want to take advantage of these data, just to give you a sense of what's available out there. And so we're going to use IPM's data that covers a whole bunch of countries, as I said, about 7,000 subnational regions. So think about districts in India, for example, is a subnational region that's going to be there. And it covers a whole bunch of countries across the development spectrum. So we can make a statement about, is the impact uniform across the development spectrum from rich countries to middle-income countries to poor countries. We have comprehensive data on 3G coverage, the rollout of 3G coverage through these maps that the GSMA has collected over time. And so we can really I'll show you a couple of maps in a minute, we can really lay them on top of each other and see what's happening. And for more of the academics in the room, the one thing you would worry about is, well, growth and adoption of new technologies is kind of endogenous, right? It's probably not random that Bangalore is a fast-growing urban city and has a lot of technological advances, right? So in the shortness of time, I won't get into the nitty-gritty details of the academics behind it, but in general, what we're going to use is an instrumental variable strategy that's been used by previous papers, but basically the idea being we're going to look at some exogenous shifters of the rollout of internet across regions, and then we're going to look at how does that exogenous shift translate into employment structures within those regions changing. Okay, so just to show you some maps, apologies if it's big on the screen, so okay, it's small here. But what do you see? This is basically in 2005. What did rollout of 3G look like, right? And some of them are really, we have 14 countries in our sample, so obviously we don't have this map for the entire world. But basically what you see is it's there in a few countries, far and few, and this is what it looks like by 2015, right? So you can see that if I just keep on going this back and forth, you can see how 3G has really expanded in these regions over the course of these 10 years. And the question we're going to ask is, how does that change what's happening in employment? So to give you a nutshell, it's a 20-minute talk, so to give you the headline results, and then and I'm more than happy to take the more detailed questions in the Q&A. Basically, what happens with 3G coverage, what we find is that there is an increase in female labor force participation. Women are more likely to get into the workforce and work. It lowers the unemployment rates for both men and women. So if you just look at it from a very macro perspective, it's improving labor force participation, it's lowering unemployment rates, right? As you would expect in some sense with new technologies. However, what was interesting to us is let's dig into what types of jobs are people doing, instead of just are they working or not, which in itself is an interesting metric, but what exactly are they doing? And that's where the gender really plays a crucial role. So what we basically find is that men are more likely to move out of unpaid jobs in agriculture, start small businesses in agriculture, or work in service sector jobs. Now, if you go to rural India, this is very, very visible in some of these places, right? Like you have these little service center type of shops, which you can see at these nukkads and these chaurahas in many of these things, and they're offering basically low-skill services in some sense, right? And so that's what you see for men transitions. For women, it's the opposite, right? So women are also in some sense likely to start owner-operated enterprises and work in the service sector. But the key difference is that they are more likely to take up these unpaid jobs that men have vacated. So if you think about a job ladder in which individuals can progress, what this basically seems to suggest is men are climbing the job ladder, they're moving into more productive opportunities like small businesses and service sector jobs, and women are basically filling in that gap of the vacuum that the men have left behind. Right? So once we put it out in the macro perspective, it's really hard. It's a complicated issue to think about the overall effect because it is still providing gainful employment to individuals, but there is still a huge gender gap that it is endogenously generating in terms of where on the job ladder do you actually find these jobs. And so the big question that policymakers and institutes like the World Bank and ADB have been interested in is, does it accelerate structural transformation? Does it move people out of agriculture into non-agricultural activities? There is some evidence of it, but it's really not the big story. It's not that it's going to transform the rural landscape and everybody's now going to start working in services, for example. And both agriculture and services seem to increase because of cell phone internet access. And it's driven by some reallocation, as I said, like people are more likely to move into service sector wage jobs, but it's also the influx of people who are not working or unemployed that are filling in these gaps in agriculture. So it's sort of a reallocation of the economy that we are seeing. So with this paper, I think it's, as I said, it's a first step in this agenda to try and explore now. So we have ongoing work in Mexico, for example, where we have excellent individual level data over time to then look at more deeper issues regarding intra-household behavior, regarding individual transitions, migration, ownership, access, so on and so forth, which are more nuanced questions. But across these 14 countries, this is a broad pattern. And so let me move on to linking this to why does it matter for why we are here. Well, the one thing we find is that women in these things are more like, in these economies are more likely to become entrepreneurs. They're more likely to start small businesses, for example. And so this nicely complements some of the other work that Penny and I were thinking about, which is what is the role of women as entrepreneurs in the economy? And of course, there's a human side of this or an equality side of this. But I don't think we have studied too much about the economic side of this in terms of development strategies, right? And so one thing we find, as I said, is mobile internet shifts more the type of work people do as opposed to the sector of work. And the big thing we find with women entrepreneurs, which is why this is relevant for the Indian context, is across the world, this is not only an India-wide statement, women entrepreneurs tend to hire more women as workers. So if you look at, so I've shown you some stats from the World Bank enterprise surveys. Basically what we seem to find is that if you take a male-owned firm where the founder is a man, for example, 25% of his workforce is going to be women. And about only 6.2% of male-owned firms will have at least one woman in a managerial position, right? This is the C-suite, the CEOs, so on and so forth. If you look at female-owned firms, what you see is 43% of female-owned firms are women, essentially. And 51% of these female-owned firms will have women as a manager in these firms. What is the problem? Obviously, for an audience like this, I don't need to tell you, the problem is we don't have enough women entrepreneurs in the economy. So if you look at the average across the world, it's about 25% of firms in an economy are women-owned. If you look at South Asia, it's less than 10%. Right? In India, in fact, it's about 8 to 9% of firms are owned by women. But even in the best case scenarios, ideal benchmarks that we have, which is Scandinavian countries, Europe, US, and so forth, it's still about 35 to 40% of firms in these countries are owned by women. So therefore, in this paper, the other thing we try and ask is, well, how large are these barriers, right? Should we care about them? I mean, yes, again, from a humanitarian and equality standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, should we care about this question at all? And how large are these barriers that women face at each step of the employment cycle? So in terms of finding work, so participation in the labor force, in terms of starting businesses, and as a panelist mentioned in the morning, many of these firms are in the informal sector, right? And so formalizing businesses is another huge barrier in India, for example, as Manish was mentioning, right? Less than 1% of India's firms are actually in the formal sector. 99% of them are in the informal sector. And what I'm going to show you is there's a gender component to that as well. And then the last thing is, as an entrepreneur, can you expand your firm? So, for example, one thing you very easily see is in many cases there have been microeconomic papers that show that with rainfall shocks, right, which economists love, right, when there are income shocks, let's think about it that way, right, to a household, women are more likely to start some small informal business in their household. This could be selling vegetables, it could be sewing garments, very small informal businesses. The problem is there are marginal costs to expanding these firms. So is it subsistence entrepreneurship, or is it actually entrepreneurship in the true sense, where you actually want to grow your firm and grow your business? And then the last question we'll end with is, if as good macroeconomists we think about, or as good policymakers, I mean, we have a lot of microeconomic evidence on this, but the big question in the policy room is, well, I want to roll this out across the entire country. And in that case, we have to then think about labor force reallocation across sectors. We have to think about aggregate equilibrium things like prices and wages changing because of these policies. And so in some sense, we are trying to take a stab at that through a model-based approach that I'll briefly outline. So in this paper, basically the exercise is going to be very simple, right? And the reason I'm spending this is because I wanted to add a research touch to the talk. It's a research talk. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the model. No equations, I promise, but just basically, pictures, right? To give you a flavor of like how one can think about, looking at data and then informing some deeper understanding from just patterns that we observe in the data. So think about an individual, right? In the model, what we're going to basically try and do is, model all of these choices. I want to show you how rich the model is in terms of incorporating many of these choices, right? So we're going to model the choices of working or not in the labor force, but conditional on work, trying to look at different types of work that you can do. Self-employment, self-employment is just owner-operated enterprises. I don't hire anybody, I'm just working on my own. Wage employment, entrepreneurship, and for entrepreneurship, working in the informal, formal sectors across sectors. Right? So agriculture, manufacturing, services, formalizing your firm, working in the informal sector, so on and so forth. So we have a fairly rich structure that, coupled with the economic census data in India, is able to give you very, very powerful insights, we feel, in terms of understanding how the entrepreneurship landscape is evolving more generally, but also the gender component that is important in the entrepreneurial landscape. So what do we find? What we basically find is our estimates seem to suggest that the labor force barriers faced by women are about twice that of men. I mean, it's not shocking, especially for this audience, right? Now, I'll tell you the interesting part. The interesting part is conditional on working, which is already a big ask, but conditional on working. The barriers to entrepreneurship for women are not actually starting firms. It's about expanding firms or growing firms. That are the huge problem where women face, as opposed to starting a small firm that I can operate out of my household. And then the last thing is, of course, as good economists, one should worry about, is it really plausible? It's a model-based approach. Should I care about this or not? Turns out the estimates that we get out of this are actually very, very strongly correlated with well-measured microeconomic norms in these states and in these regions. So it's actually informative to sort of match. That's been my research interest in terms of trying to match the microeconomic rich studies with some macroeconomic perspectives through aggregation, through thinking about what would happen if you were to scale up these policies and interventions. The other interesting insight that we get out of this paper, and I'll wrap up with that, is basically when we think about, again, policies, and coming to the discussion we had in the morning on norms versus jobs, the demand side versus the supply side, right? What we basically find, yes, supply side is very hard to change. The beauty of economics in these models is you can run counterfactual simulations, right? You could think about what would the world look like, right? If I were to tweak certain things in my model, what would the economy look like? Right? It's obviously a counterfactual scenario that we don't have data on, but I think it's informative to tell us where the true constraints are coming from in the economy. So what we find is if you just do supply side, right? Suppose magically tomorrow I'm able to change social norms in the sectors. Well, you do get female labor force participation rising very sharply by design, but what you do find is actually in equilibrium, once you take into account the exogenous labor supply increase of women, wages in equilibrium for women might actually go down, right? Because now you've just removed supply-side barriers, you haven't really removed the demand-side barriers. So there are no extra women entrepreneurs. Some of them will be entrepreneurs, but not a lot. But now there's a huge influx of women in the labor force, right? It's still beneficial on average, because on average, these women are still sitting at home and doing nothing in terms of earning wages, right? So putting them into the productive workforce does earn them wages, but on average, it is possible that equilibrium wages are falling. So purely supply-side initiatives might be beneficial on average, but might have these unintended consequences of lowering wages, for example. On the other hand, policies that target entrepreneurship, right, will have more women entrepreneurs. But here's the kick. The kick is because women entrepreneurs tend to hire more women. For every 1% increase that you have, you're going to get more than 1% increase in female labor force participation. Because these women entrepreneurs are going to be able to draw out more women to work for them in the workforce as well. So that's why I feel like, especially from the angle of entrepreneurship, it's really important to focus on the demand side and think about boosting female entrepreneurship, also from the larger aim of having an increase in female labor force participation. So let me stop and conclude, and as I said, this is the first step. But to put synthesize the insights from both of these papers, what we are basically finding is that digital technologies do generate employment, but the transitions are different across gender. But it really seems to be the type of work that people are doing as opposed to the sector of work that they're working in that seems to matter. And demand side policies are actually super important, or we should think about it more seriously in terms of how can we form reliable policy. This goes back to Manish's point on like, should we set the metrics or the goal? But I think even the goal here should be taken seriously, which is what productive demand side policies can we think about, especially when it comes to women entrepreneurship, given that we have this robust pattern of women hiring more women, and there are these externalities that one can think about in terms of improving female labor force participation. And a plug for some ongoing work, so stay tuned for that. But essentially, as I said, we are working on more detailed studies in specific countries, trying to understand more nuanced impacts of the rollout of 3G internet. We're using online job portals in the Indian context, for example, trying to look at what are some of these job search patterns from a microeconomic perspective in terms of, say, looking at jobs, applying for jobs, accepting job offers, and so on and so forth, where there has been a big black box. We don't really know that. We know Gaurav was working as a graduate student. He's now at UVA. We don't really know what did the search process look like. And to give you a preliminary flavor, we're finding even the search process is very, very different for women. So one fact, I don't have this now, but one fact that we find, for example, is women are more likely to look across industries within the same location. Men are more likely to look across locations, but within the same industry. Right? And if there are returns to being in the same industry, with job tenure, with all of these things, men are accruing just more of those returns, whereas women are constrained by location, so they have to shift across industries. And they're losing out some of this capital. So I think there's much more interesting work in this space, so let me stop there and take some questions. Thank you. Am I moderating this, or? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
That's a good idea. Let's take 3 questions and we'll come back to that.
Hi, Gaurav. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm Sandeep from IISA Bhopal. So, given the conclusions you have regarding that even if labor force participation might increase and wages fall, are you taking 2 separate markets for male labor force and female labor force, or I was not clear on how that's working?
Thanks, Gaurav, for that really interesting presentation. I was curious about why women hire women. Is there any pattern that emerges in terms of sectors, that these women entrepreneurs are concentrated in? I mean, can we make sense of the why question? And thanks again for a really interesting presentation.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm Revati. I work in SEVA as well as World Agroforestry Research. And I both have a question and an appeal, being more of a practitioner than a researcher. I thought the model-based approach was really interesting. And something that we have been looking at on the ground is, in addition to the 3 categories that you listed there, also the idea of a collective enterprise, looking at, referring back to what Mahua was talking about. Because I think when we talk about entrepreneurship and employment, the shift of power is also important, and it has a role in, what kind of labor force are we going to see. And especially in sectors like the agricultural sector, we find that collective enterprises really matters in retaining the social frameworks that a lot of organizations really work hard in terms of collectivization of women and the social and political empowerment that results from it. And the other aspect that we've seen looking at digitization is smartphone access, ownership, and so on. I'm sure this must be part of the rabbit hole you're digging into in future work, but you can have households that have smartphones, but usually the male member of the family might have more access, or the children may have access. The women may have different levels of comfort in terms of using it, and that plays a role in terms of how well they can use it and for what they use it. Thank you.
I'm going to let you respond.
Thank you. So, to I think the earlier question on are there separate markets for men and women? Yes, absolutely there are. So wages are determined separately for men and women, which is what you would see also in the data, for example. But there is some connection to that. There is some complementarity of labor. So it's not completely isolated labor markets altogether. You working in a firm, you work with a bunch of men and women both, and so there are some complementarities and substitutabilities that we consider. Now, I think to the other 2 points, why do women hire women? I think is the million-dollar question. I think, and I think, it's interesting to know that robustly across countries over time, across sectors, across regions, we see this pattern. So this is not explained by just garment industries, for example, where there are more women entrepreneurs and women workers just by chance. It's across the board. It's across the development spectrum. And so, the problem with speculating too much is everybody can come up with their own theory on why that is the case, right? So I think, the more people I talk to, everybody tells me their story of why they think this is going on. It could be comfort, it could be social norms, it could be a lot of things that, Rohini has a lot of work on this in taking a woman to work, for example, or taking your friends to work, for example. So I think that there could be lots of hypotheses that one could test, and I think one should test them in terms of trying to unpack this. But I think the aim that we at least had in this exercise was to robustly document this and say, this is an important pattern. We should set up, take notice, and then figure out why that is happening. To collective enterprises, I think I completely agree. I think, in fact, to take a step further, many of these are also family-owned firms, right? And so once you think about it in terms of these additional nuances that you would want to add, it becomes interesting to be able to unpack some of these channels, which are obviously important, but we can't do everything in one paper. Is I think but your point is very well taken in the sense that we are actually exploring that in subsequent work, trying to look at family-owned enterprises and whether that is another way through which people can get into the workforce. And smartphone ownership, in fact, if you look at the IHDS data. That is borne out in the data. Access and availability of technology is 100% not the same across gender. The smartphone in the house is usually owned by the man or the eldest son or something, and then women don't know how to operate it, or they don't even have access to it in many cases, and they have to wait for the husband to come home from work to then look at that. To some extent, that's changing. To some extent, like if you look at smartphone ownership, especially in the last 4 or 5 years after COVID, around that time, after demonetization and stuff, that's changing to some extent. And now, for example, at least in some of the contexts, it's urban areas. I can't speak for, obviously nothing in India is generalizable is one story I've learned pretty quickly. So please don't think of this as like a general statement about the country. I don't think anyone who makes that is fooling himself or herself. But to the extent that we find that we do find that there are lots, especially the young women, which I think that holds a lot of promise. So I have a lot of work in Mumbai and Delhi, low-income areas, and where there we find that young women are actually way more motivated to use smartphones to find jobs, as opposed to young men, for example. So there is some promise to knowing that things are changing.
Thanks, Gaurav. Are there any more hands? Because we're really short.